There is a law on the books right now, signed, sealed, and set to take effect on January 1st, 2027, that could hand a $10 million fine to the volunteers who build and distribute free software that millions of people around the world depend on every single day. Not a corporation, not a tech giant, volunteers. People running Linux distributions out of their homes, out of university basements, on donations that barely cover server costs. A single non-compliant download to a child anywhere across the US states is all it takes to count as a violation, and those violations stack. At $200 per affected child, the fines land not on the user, but on the volunteers who built and distributed the software. For a project earning $27 a month, even one enforcement action could end everything overnight, and potentially bankrupt the people behind it personally. The law is real, the fines are real. And the software at the center of this story is called Linux, an operating system that powers everything from your smart TV to the servers that deliver every email you have ever sent. You may never have heard the name, but this story affects you directly, and I will explain exactly why in a moment. But here is what makes this story more extraordinary than it first appears. The lawmaker who created this problem is now the same lawmaker trying to fix it. And the fix, a quiet amendment moving through the California legislature right now, may not arrive in time. Later in this video, we will show you exactly what one of these small Linux projects earns every month and compare it to the fine it could face. The number will stop you cold. Let us start with the number that puts everything in focus. Brazil, one of the largest countries on Earth, enacted a digital age verification law in March of 2026. The penalty for an operating system provider that fails to comply is 50 million Brazilian reais. In American dollars, that is approximately $9.5 million per violation. At the same time, California, the fifth largest economy in the world, signed its own version of this law in October 2025. Under California's Digital Age Assurance Act, known as Assembly Bill 1043, penalties reach $2,500 per affected child for a negligent violation and $7,500 per child for an intentional one. Those numbers sound manageable until you do the math. California has nearly 40 million residents. If a Linux distribution were found to have served software to even a fraction of that population without age compliance, the total fines would be astronomical, easily climbing past $10 million. Quickly. Now consider who these laws are aimed at: Microsoft, Apple, Google. Companies with billions of dollars in legal reserves and compliance teams with hundreds of lawyers. But the law does not distinguish between Apple and a two-person team of volunteers maintaining a Linux distribution on $27 a month in Patreon donations. $27 a month. That is not a misprint. We will come back to that figure, because it is the detail that makes this entire story real. Both laws, California's and Brazil's, use nearly identical language. They require every operating system provider to collect age information from users at account setup and transmit that data to application developers through a real-time interface. And the definition of an operating system provider is broad enough to capture not just Windows and Mac OS, but every Linux distribution on the planet: Debian, Ubuntu, Arch Linux, Fedora, and hundreds of others. All of them subject to the same rules as Apple. What no one expected was what happened inside Linux itself, in the very code that boots your computer. That is coming up, and it changes the picture entirely. To understand why this is serious, you need to understand what Linux actually is. Linux is not a product you buy in a store. It is not owned by a corporation. It is a free, open-source operating system, meaning anyone can read its code, copy it, modify it, and distribute it. It was created in 1991 by a Finnish computer science student named Linus Torvalds, who simply wanted a better operating system for his personal computer. Today, Linux runs the majority of the world's internet infrastructure. It powers Android phones. It runs the servers behind Google, Amazon, and Netflix. It runs the computers aboard the International Space Station. If you have used a smart television in the last decade, there is a reasonable chance Linux was running silently underneath the screen. But here is the part that most people do not know. Linux does not come from a single company. It comes from a global patchwork of independent distributions, commonly called distros, each one maintained by a different team. Some are backed by corporations. Red Hat, which is now owned by IBM, is one. Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu, is another. But the majority of Linux distributions are run by volunteers, small groups of developers. Sometimes just a handful of individuals who believe that free, open software is a public good worth maintaining. These projects run on donations. They have no legal departments, no compliance teams, no reserve set aside for regulatory penalties. When a law like California's Assembly Bill 1043 passes, it does not just create a compliance challenge, it creates an existential threat. And the law did pass. On October 13, 2025, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed the Digital Age Assurance Act into law. The bill was authored by Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks, a Democrat from Oakland who had spent years working on child safety legislation. The bill passed the California Assembly 76-0. It passed the California Senate 38-0. Not a single vote against it in either chamber. The stated goal was straightforward and genuinely well-intentioned: protect children online by building age verification infrastructure at the operating system level so that apps could know whether a user was a child before displaying age-restricted content. What no one in Sacramento appeared to consider was what would happen when that obligation landed on a developer running their Linux project out of a spare bedroom. And then something happened in the code itself, something that set off a firestorm among developers worldwide. That is next, March 18, 2026. That is the date that changed everything. On that day, a change was merged into Systemd, the foundational software component that boots virtually every modern Linux computer. The change was small, technically. A single new data field added to the user record database. It was called birth date. Its stated purpose, written plainly in the code submission, was compliance with California's AB 1043, Colorado's age verification law, and Brazil's Lei 15.211. The pull request, the technical term for a proposed code change, was submitted by a contributor using the GitHub username Dylan Taylor. Luca Bacassi, a Systemd maintainer who works for Microsoft, approved and merged it. Within 48 hours, that single code change had attracted 945 comments. The Linux developer community erupted. Critics did not object to protecting children online. They objected to the principle that surveillance infrastructure for government age verification laws had been quietly inserted into the foundational layer of nearly every Linux computer on Earth. One developer called it a compliance mechanism masquerading as a convenience feature. Others warned it was the first brick in a wall that would eventually require full identity verification at the operating system level. Someone opened a counterproposal to remove the change entirely. Lennart Pettering, the German software engineer who originally created Systemd and had recently left Microsoft to found his own startup, rejected the removal. He argued the birthdate field was optional. His response was direct: it enforces zero policy. It leaves that up for other parts of the system. The field remained in the code. The debate did not end. Meanwhile, one of the smallest and most principled Linux projects in the world was facing a question with no good answer: comply with laws that contradict your core values, or risk fines that would destroy everything you have built. That project, and the staggering gap between what it earns and what it could be fined, is the human story at the center of this. And it is coming up right after this. California and Brazil were not acting alone. They were part of something larger. The United Kingdom's Online Safety Act had already established the template, pushing age assurance requirements toward internet platforms and, by extension, toward the software that runs them. Texas passed its own age verification law. Utah followed. Colorado introduced Senate Bill 20-051 in 2026. Brazil's Lei 15.211 took effect in March of the same year. And legislators in other states and countries were watching California closely. The pattern was clear. Governments around the world were reaching for the same lever, the operating system, as the place to solve a problem they had failed to solve at the application layer. The logic had a certain appeal. If you verify age once, at the machine level, every app that runs on that machine can trust the signal. No more individual sites and apps making their own age checks. The operating system becomes the gatekeeper. For Apple and Google, this was manageable. Both already require users to create accounts when setting up a device. Both have centralized app stores. Both have legal teams in every jurisdiction. Adding a birthdate field to an existing account system is, for them, a compliance task. Inconvenient and expensive, but survivable. For Linux, it was structurally incompatible with how the software works. Most Linux distributions have no centralized user accounts. There is no Linux account you sign into when you install Ubuntu or Debian or Arch Linux. You create a local account on your machine that belongs to you. No company holds it. No company can verify it. And the definition of operating system provider in the California law: anyone who develops, licenses, or controls the operating system software on a computer mobile device, or any other general-purpose computing device, sweeps in every single one of them. Midnight BSD, an open-source operating system project, made the calculation quickly. In early 2026, the project quietly modified its license to prohibit California residents from using the software for desktop purposes, effective January 1, 2027. The project also blocked downloads from California and Brazilian IP addresses. A volunteer project with no legal budget and no corporate backing made the only choice it felt it could. It barred an entire state and an entire country from using its software rather than risk fines it could never pay. It was an extraordinary step, and it raised a question that no one in Sacramento had apparently considered when they wrote the law. What happens when the only way for a small open-source project to comply is to stop serving its users entirely? The answer to that question has a face and a name, and the numbers behind it are unlike anything you would expect. The Debian project has approximately 1,000 volunteer developers scattered across the world. It is one of the oldest and most widely used Linux distributions in existence, the foundation on which Ubuntu is built, which is itself the foundation for dozens of other systems. Debian has no CEO, no investor funding. Its annual budget would not cover a single compliance lawyer's retainer at a major firm. Under California's Digital Age Assurance Act, Debian is subject to the same legal requirements as Apple. But Debian's is not the most stark example. That distinction belongs to a project called Hyperbola. Hyperbola is a Linux distribution with a small but devoted following. It was founded in Brazil. It runs on older hardware, including computers over 20 years old that most manufacturers abandoned long ago. It follows the Free Software Foundation's strictest principles: no proprietary code, no data collection, no telemetry. Its developers believe, genuinely and consistently, that software should belong to its users, and that no third party should be able to track or identify those users through the tools they use. In other words, Hyperbola is, by design and by conviction, exactly the kind of project that cannot comply with an age verification law without betraying everything it stands for. And its monthly income from Patreon, its primary source of donation funding, is $27. $27 a month. The potential fine under Brazil's law, $9.5 million per violation. Under California's law, thousands of dollars per affected child multiplied across a user base in the millions. One download, one user in the wrong jurisdiction, one failure to provide an age bracket signal that Hyperbola is philosophically opposed to collecting in the first place. That is the gap between what this project earns and what it could owe. The personal dimension makes it worse. These are not corporate officers insulated by limited liability. These are individual developers. If a project like Hyperbola were pursued under a law like this, the exposure could fall on the people themselves. Their savings, their homes, their futures. This is not a hypothetical. When Brazil's Lei 15.211 took effect in March of 2026, projects that had any connection to Brazil, servers, mirrors, download points, suddenly found themselves within the legal reach of a $9.5 million penalty framework. A community-maintained Linux fork blocked access from both Brazilian and California IP addresses on the very day the Brazilian law took effect. Their statement was blunt: a volunteer project with no user database and no corporate backing had no other option. These are not faceless entities. They are people who built something they believed in, for free, for the benefit of everyone. And they are being asked to choose between their principles and their financial survival. Is worth pausing here and being fair about what these laws are actually trying to accomplish. The children's safety argument is not manufactured. It is real and it is serious. Children are encountering harmful content online, sextortion, cyberbullying, exposure to extreme material, at younger ages and in more damaging contexts than at any previous point in history. California's Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks spent years working on these issues before AB 1043. She is not a cynical actor. She is a legislator who looked at a genuine problem and reached for what seemed like a structural solution. The logic of operating system level age verification is not absurd. If you build the check into the machine itself, you create a single point of verification that every application can rely on. No more whack-a-mole enforcement against individual websites. One system, one standard, one signal. The Electronic Frontier Foundation and privacy advocates counter that this logic leads somewhere dangerous. Age verification requires identification. Identification requires a database of every user's age and device, held by operating system providers or by government accessible systems, is surveillance infrastructure, regardless of the intention behind it. Today it verifies age. Tomorrow, under different laws and different governments, it verifies identity, political affiliation, or something else entirely. The architecture once built can be used for purposes its original designers never intended. For Linux specifically, there is a third problem that neither side has fully answered: enforcement. California's law is enforceable by the state attorney general, but Linux distributions are maintained by people in Germany, Brazil, Australia, Canada, and dozens of other countries. The code can be copied, forked, and redistributed by anyone. You cannot serve a subpoena on a GitHub repository. You cannot fine a codebase. Who exactly is responsible when there is no single controlling entity? Governor Newsom himself acknowledged this when he signed the bill. His signing statement explicitly called for the California legislature to address complexities in the 2026 session, including multi-user accounts, family shared devices, and the situation facing open-source developers. He signed a law he knew needed repair, and the repair is now underway. On February 11, 2026, just 4 months after the original law was signed, Assemblywoman Wicks introduced Assembly Bill 1856. The amendment rewrites the definition of operating system provider to exclude any entity distributing software under licenses that allow users to copy, redistribute, and modify it. In plain English, Linux would be exempt. As of the end of May 2026, that amendment had passed its second reading in the California legislature and was moving toward a final vote. The deadline is January 1st, 2027, but the amendment is not yet law. It has not passed. And even if it does, it covers California, not Brazil, not Colorado, not the dozen other states and countries moving in the same direction. The fundamental conflict between open-source software and government age verification mandates is not resolved by one state's amendment. It is deferred. We open this story with a number: $10 million. The kind of fine that would not merely close a project like Hyperbola, it would financially destroy the individuals behind it, personally and permanently. And we end with a picture of what those people actually are: volunteers, developers, believers in the idea that software should be free, that it should respect its users, that no company or government should be able to sit inside your machine and monitor who you are or how old you are. They built something from conviction for free, and they serve it to anyone who wants it. That picture and that $10 million number sitting alongside it is the clearest illustration yet of something that is going to define the next decade of technology: governments writing laws for a corporate, centralized internet and colliding with a world where significant parts of the internet are not corporate and not centralized at all. The collision is not hypothetical anymore. It happened on March 18th, 2026, when a single line of code appeared in the heart of Linux asking for your date of birth. It happened when Midnight BSD told the entire state of California it could no longer use their software. It is happening right now in the California legislature, where a lawmaker is racing to fix a law she wrote before the clock runs out. If California's amendment passes, Linux gets a reprieve in California. Brazil, Colorado, and every jurisdiction moving towards similar laws will not be bound by it. The larger battle has barely begun. What you can do if you care about this is pay attention. When technology companies and their lobbyists speak in these hearings, they speak for their own interests. The Debian developer in Germany does not have a lobbyist in Sacramento. The Hyperbola volunteer in Brazil does not have anyone in Brasilia making the case that $27 a month cannot absorb a $9.5 million fine. The only people making that case are the ones paying attention, and now you are one of them. In our next video, we are going to look at what happened to Windows users who found themselves abandoned by Microsoft, the millions of people still running Windows 10 when support ended in October 2025, and what their real options actually are. Because if this story about Linux and free software matters to you, that story connects directly to it. These are not separate issues. They are the same issue: who controls the computer sitting in your home, and what rights do you actually have over it. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who ought to know this story. Subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next, and thank you for watching.